As we journey through this Holy Week, we started on Palm Sunday with Matthew's Gospel because we're in a year where we read from Matthew. But Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, and tomorrow Easter Vigil we spend in the Gospel of John. On Maundy, Thursday, we started in the 13th chapter, and last night we talked about the first line of that story is that Jesus, knowing his time had come, loved his own who were given to him in the world and loved them to the end. And that beginning of that journey then to the cross, that idea that he loved his own who were in the world and loved them to the end, really sets the tone for what happened last night and what was the Last Supper that Jesus had with his disciples, the whole of his passion story today, and then tomorrow at Easter Vigil when we get to the Easter story. He loved them to the end, and what we find in today's gospel reading is what that looks like to love them to the end. It looks like walking into a garden and being betrayed, but making sure that the rest were kept safe. As they gathered around him to arrest him, he said, "Let the others go. It's me that you're looking for," right? He protected them in that space. Then as he is before Pilate, he could have defended himself. Probably wouldn't have gotten very far because it was a sham trial where they were manufacturing things to charge him with. And had he defended himself, it might have drawn some of them back in, right, as witnesses and other things. So he continues to love them to the end by protecting them. As he gets beaten and abused and put on the cross, all of that is where he meets us in the worst of our humanity, which is one of the ways that he loves us to the end. And as we find him loving those that were given him to the end, we find those surrounding him. On Maundy, Thursday, we heard the text there. Jesus says, "As I have loved you, so you should love one another." Well, part of that is an invitation to love one another to the end. And in the story that we hear today, we find that loving people to the end, following Jesus to the end, maybe isn't so easy. Peter was perfectly happy to be right there with Jesus as long as he had a sword. Right there in the garden, he's like, "I'm with you, Jesus," and starts swinging, right? And Jesus says, "Nope, put that away." As soon as he has to put the sword away, following Jesus gets to be a little bit more challenging. So that when he finds himself in that place of Jesus' trial and people start to ask him, "Are you the one?" He's like, "I'm not that guy." Not having a sword, it was one bit too far for him to go. This is kind of like... There's lots of kind of game shows out there, quiz shows and guest shows and all kinds of other things. And sometimes in those shows, there is a point in time where the host will look at the contestant and say, "All right, you've earned this much money. You can take that and go home, or you can risk it and try to get even more." And whenever you're in that part of the game show and it's getting to be a large amount of money and the decision's getting harder, the host will say something like, "What could this money mean to you?" And it's always something important, right? I could pay off my debts, I could go back to school, I could buy my mom the house she never had, right? And the idea for the show is to set up this difficult choice of, I've gotten to a point where there's something pretty good, but am I willing to risk it to go even further? This is the choice that Peter has, right? He's been on this great journey with Jesus, and he's gotten to a place where it's been pretty good, but going further is starting to look like you're risking everything you've already gotten, and you're not sure that that next step is going to be all that great. And Peter's not the only one. When we get to the end of the story, we learn about Joseph of Arimathea, who was a secret disciple, which means the whole time he was willing to follow Jesus, just not publicly, because he knew following him publicly would somehow have an impact on his life, on his status in the community, and everything else. Same with Nicodemus. He snuck out at night to have a conversation with Jesus. Something about following Jesus publicly was too much for him. So even as Jesus is loving people to the end, we find people getting to that point in the game show of following Jesus where they say, "You know what, that might be a little bit too much for me. I think I'll just stop right here where I am." And it can then, on this Good Friday, invite us to wrestle with that same question. Is there a point where following Jesus pushes us beyond where we're comfortable, even if it might be hugely transformative and life-giving, and we decide that maybe we're okay just where we are? I think of a mission trip I was able to take as a seminary intern to the high desert in Tijuana, Mexico, to build homes for people. We did this between Christmas and New Year's, and it's actually quite cold in the desert at night. We slept out on a campground that was made for these mission trips, and our showers, after sweating in the heat all day, building houses, was just a big block building that was no longer a building. It was meant probably to be a shower building with a roof, but it was just cinder block walls and shower spigots that weren't hooked up to anything. So the shower, the way you showered was there was just big 55-gallon drums of very cold water and then buckets. Now, some of the college kids among us hadn't quite figured out you could pace yourself, so they would just dump it over their heads, and then you would hear their shouts echo throughout the valley as they lamented that decision. We showed them, you can just wash your face and stop, and then wash an arm and stop. But amidst all that, right, we're working all day, we're doing this, we're building homes for some very, very poor people, and then we're standing around the campfire, and one of the guys says, I see the value of what we're doing here. I understand maybe what Jesus could be calling us to do to serve the world, but I really like hot showers. It was an honest statement, right? I'm willing to follow Jesus, but only so far, right? I'm not willing to give up my hot showers permanently, right, on that journey. There was another ministry in that congregation. They started a foundation to invest in the kids of Haiti. And on the sort of pilot trip that they went to Cité Soleil, which is the poorest slum in the poorest country in our hemisphere, right? And as they visited a little hovel, a woman went to hand her baby to one of the women. And their guide said, "Do not take that baby." Because she thought, this woman just, "Oh, do you want to hold my baby?" And she said, "Why not?" And he said, "She wants you to take her baby." Like, she looks at you and says, "My baby will be better off with you than in the poverty that I live in." And he said, "You can't take that baby." That was hugely transformative for her in her faith, right? She was pushed beyond any place she had imagined she was going to be pushed. But some years later, when one of her daughters was in her early 20s, they said, "Hey, we're taking another trip to Haiti. Do you want to go?" And her answer was, "No. I'm not ready for my life to have to change," because she saw what it had done to her mom. So just like those game shows, right, where you get to a point where you have to make a choice, following Jesus can be comfortable, but we can get to places where hot showers, comfortable beds, comfortable everything else makes continuing that journey perhaps a little more challenging. Some of it can be in these stories of service. Some of it can be in our generosity. Jesus talks about the people in the flowing robes that make big showy gifts, but it doesn't really impact their lifestyle, versus the widow who gives everything, and it probably does. But it's not just about how we serve and how we give. If someone comes to you and says, "I'm really sorry for that thing I did that hurt you, can you forgive me?" Is that an easy thing to do? Not always. Is it easier to do that than if they don't ask for forgiveness and continue to do the same things that hurt you? Jesus says keep forgiving over and over and over, and we might say, "Okay, I can follow that," but then at some point we may go, but not that way. That's too much. I'm not going to keep doing that. And whether it's forgiveness, whether it's giving, whether it's serving, there are so many ways that we are invited to follow Jesus. I think about homeless people, right, that stop by here for help. Some of them are super gracious and very humble, and it's very easy to help them. We had a family stop in here one day, and they were not, but we tried to be helpful anyway. And we had a bit of a dispute about the charges with the hotel, and when I was calling the hotel trying to work that out where we had put them up, they finally just said, "Look, they're not nice to us." It is very easy to help people who are thankful and gracious and humble. Not so much so when they're not. And so we land in those spaces where following Jesus can be a little challenging. On this Good Friday, we are invited to sit with Peter as that rooster crows, and he has to now see that maybe he wasn't as into this following Jesus as he thought he was. Come Easter, we start to tell a different story, right, where Peter actually turns it around and gets to a new space. But what we understand is that he doesn't do that on his own. It's Jesus working through him. And we actually already see that in today's story. As Jesus commends his mother to the beloved disciple, and the beloved disciple to his mother, the story tells us that right away that disciple took her in. Jesus has challenged him, right, to take in Jesus' mom and care for her from now on, and he's able to say yes to that, even though it probably caused all sorts of things to change. And then we find Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus actually doing something pretty risky. They're the secret followers of Jesus, but they're the ones that go to Pilate and say, can we have his body? Now they're public, right? They're out now, and everybody's going to know that they're the ones that did that. That's a risky step. Could they take that on their own? Or could they take that because Jesus was with them? Good Friday is always a time where I don't want to get too close to Easter yet, right? We should sit a little bit in that discomfort that we have, that we maybe don't always stretch and get that transformation that the gospel brings us because it just feels too far for us to go. We'll get there on Easter, which is not that far away. Today, the blessing we have is that blessing of discomfort, because it's sometimes in that holy discomfort that God is going to work on us with grace to change us and transform us into those people that God created us to be. Amen.